Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Mining on native land is historically a point of conflict, but a tribe in Nevada has an agreement with a mining company that spells out conditions that aren't in many other such documents. It could be a model for cooperation between tribes and industry, but it also happens at a time when federal officials are working to rid influence from tribes and anyone else when it comes to invoking environmental constraints on extractive industries. We'll look at two competing directions right after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. The Alaska Federation of Natives is pulling out all the stops to block a Safari Club International proposal to reform the Federal Subsistence Board. As KMBA's Rhonda McBride reports, AFN says it's a direct threat to the Alaska Native subsistence way of life.
Last year, Safari Club International, a sport hunting and fishing group, petitioned two Trump cabinet members for the review. It asked Interior Secretary Doug Burgum and Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins to address what it calls federal overreach in subsistence management. In December, the Interior Department granted the request and announced a 60-day review called a scoping process. During this time, it will consider the Safari Club's recommendations, which includes a proposal to limit the size of the Federal Subsistence Board to only the heads of 5 federal agencies. Ben Malott, president of the Alaska Federation of Natives, says this would eliminate public seats, including 3 held by tribal representatives.
We've been working for that for a very long time, so we are concerned that any rollback in public member seats would just weaken our voices. And so for us, that is a major threat.
But beyond changing the leadership structure of subsistence management, the Safari Club calls on federal agency heads when setting regulations to defer to state managers, a move that opponents say would undermine the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA, legislation Congress passed 45 years ago to protect Alaska's rural subsistence lifestyle. John Sturgeon, a leading advocate for the Alaska Safari Club, says this is a fight about fish and game management, not about the rights of rural Alaskans to subsist.
We have no problem with subsistence. We support it. So it's kind of a perceived conflict because we just think the state of Alaska should be the one that's in charge of subsistence.
The problem is the state's constitution does not allow for a rural subsistence priority, which federal law mandates. Public comment on the Safari Club proposals closes on February 13th. In Anchorage, I'm Rhonda McBride.
Indigenous Knowledge Focus Centers are on their way to Spokane Falls Community College and the Spokane Community College campus on the Spokane Reservation in Washington. As Steve Jackson reports, a grant from Avista Utilities is providing the seed money.
The Indigenous Healing Environments Across Lifeways, or IHEAL centers, will hold workshops on skills and concepts related to sustainability of water, land, animals, and climate. They'll also include studies related to using plants for food and medicine. Spokane College's Tribal Relations Director, Naomi Bender, says she will seek out Indigenous presenters from tribes in the region. But she says instructors will be careful in what they present.
Traditional knowledge of plants and medicines, for example, was illegal in the United States. And to this day, we're very careful about what's actually shared and what's not, because people want to monetize and want to harm with what knowledge they gain at times.
Bender says both Indigenous and non-Native students will be welcome at the IHEAL centers. She anticipates they'll begin holding workshops in about a year. For National Native News, I'm Steve Jackson reporting from Spokane.
Congress recently approved more than $13 million in federal funding for the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico for fiscal year 2026. This comes after the Trump administration's proposal to eliminate IAIA's federal appropriation. The funding maintains the Institute's current funding level to support academic programs, student services, and general operations. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Kawanak Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by Sonosky Chambers Law, championing tribal sovereignty and Native American rights since 1976. From opioids litigation to treaty rights to tribal self-governance. With offices in Washington, D.C., New Mexico, California, and Alaska. Sonosky Chambers Law. Support by the American Indian College Fund, providing millions of dollars of scholarships to Native students every year. Applications are accepted through May 31st at collegefund.org or by phone at 800-766-FUND.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The chairman of the Shoshone Paiute Tribes of the Duck Valley Reservation is touting a recent partnership with a mining company as the first of its kind in the continental United States. It gives the tribe a share of profits and commits to standards set by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It also has provisions to support the tribe's language revitalization projects along with economic development. Native legal advisors who oversee agreements between tribes and mining developers call it a new standard. Today on our show, we'll talk with the chairman of the tribe and Native legal experts about what makes this agreement unique. Later in the hour, we'll also discuss a new proposal by the federal government to limit the ability of tribes to block oil pipelines. You can join this conversation. Does your tribe have a history with mining? Let us know by calling 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now on Zoom in Oahe, Nevada, on the Duck Valley Reservation is Brian Mason. He is the chairman of the Shoshone Paiute Tribes of the Duck Valley Reservation. Chairman Mason, good morning and welcome to Native America Calling.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Also on Zoom today in Los Angeles, California, we have Kate Finn. She is the founder and director of the Tallgrass Institute, and she is Osage. Kate, good morning and welcome to the show to you as well.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
And joining us from Missoula, Montana is Miranda Compton. She is the founder and president of the consulting company Lepway, and she's a citizen of the Delaware Tribes. Miranda, good morning. Welcome to Native America Calling.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on and excited for the conversation.
I'm excited for the conversation, too. Great to have you all as guests. And Chairman Mason, let's begin with you because you have described this agreement with Canadian mining company Integra Resources as historic. How so?
Well, it's in Nevada anyway, having worked for the mining industry and corporate social responsibility programs with the largest gold producer in the globe, Barrick. I started a Native American Affairs program where we've been, dancing around the edges of one of these for a long time, probably since 2004, and it never happened. And, since, when you're talking mining in the United States, if Nevada was its own country, it'd be the fourth largest producing country in the world because Nevada is one big pit. So all the tribes have been dealing with mining here in Nevada. And, we've seen, mining companies come and go. We've seen, offers and negotiations for years. We had elders testify in 2006 for the passage eventually of the UNDREP, UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. So elders here in the state have been very involved with mining, and this is the first of its kind to happen in the lower 48. It's very common in Canada, which is kind of weird. But we had the opportunity to go to Canada with Integra, and they took us to the golden, what's referred to as the Golden Triangle on the Yukon, and got to meet with the Tahltan Nation and watched how that was implemented up there, how agreements are made with the First Nations people, because they are a signature of UNDRIP. You know, for a while, 4 countries had never signed the Indigenous Peoples Declaration. One was the United States, one was Canada, one was Australia, one was New Zealand. Canada signed in 2006, and they made a sea change and they went a different direction while working with their Indigenous peoples. And we're hoping to get there someday down here. And, you know, like I said, I've been in this part of the industry, you know, community relations, government affairs, corporate social responsibility for quite some time. And it's refreshing to get as far as we just got. So.
Yeah, it sounds like it, Chairman. Thank you. Now, Integra Resources is saying that it will follow standards that have been set by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What are those standards, and are there any examples we can point to?
Yeah, so some of the standards in the First Nations, you know, they actually, so down here in the lower 48, they refer to it as NEPA, right? It's the permitting process for any project. Doesn't have to be a mine, it can be a road or whatnot, where tribes, you know, have that consultation obligation and right with the U.S. government on whatever agency is doing the project. Could be Forest Service, could be the Air Force, could be the BLM. In Nevada and in Idaho, most commonly it's with the BLM or the Forest Service. And that's just the process where the tribes are able to consult and engage with projects. Where in Canada and over to the Northwest Territories, Vancouver area, Pacific Northwest in Canada, they're starting something different where the tribes are actually consulting and consenting. And it's now part of their, and I don't want to call it NEPA because it wouldn't be NEPA, but it's part of the law for them to start extracting. And it doesn't have to be ore, doesn't have to be minerals. It's just any natural resource that they're extracting. It's the inclusion of the First Nations people. And they have to be at the table, and at the end of the day, they actually get a part of the company, they get a financial benefit, and some of those are very, very high. And so, you know, when you're talking about peoples, for example, in Nevada, you know, we've got 28 tribes in the state of Nevada. All of them are non-revenue tribes. In other words, we have no source of income. All the tribes in the state of Nevada are reliant on, you know, 638 funding, BIA funds. So once you're able to have a revenue stream, these are streams that you can apply to help with your infrastructure, your people's education, you know, economic development and the such. So
Chairman,
you know, it's an important thing. Yeah.
You have a background working in the mining industry. I'm curious how that experience was able to assist you in negotiating this partnership and how it evolved.
So I likened it to, you know, I'm a military guy. I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps and then went to college. And I got my degrees in business, marketing, and international relations. And when I came home, I went on a pine nut picking trip. You know, the tribes go pine nut picking every year. And it happened to be on the property of the largest mine in the state of Nevada, a mine called Cortez, owned by Barrick. And I knew that at the time there was a huge war going on between mining and the tribes, specifically my tribe, you know, the Western Shoshone. And it involved a bunch of Western Shoshone tribes. And it was literally an open war on the permitting of this mine. And so I knew that that's where I belonged. I had to get in the fight, and the best way to engage into something is to learn what it is, so you can learn how to win. And so I applied for a position there, became an environmental engineer, environmental superintendent, later became community relations, government affairs, Native American programming. And that's how I started with them. But I stayed with Barrick. Like I said, it's the largest gold mining company in the globe for production. And I stayed with them about 15 years until I come back home.
Are there any provisions in this partnership now that you made sure were included based on having so much experience working in gold mining?
Well, we know that, mining is here in Nevada is upwards to a, $12 billion business for the companies. And we know that we're the poorest people on every social economic platform there is in the state. And it doesn't matter what it is. It could be suicides, hunger, substance abuse, single parent families, housing shortages. The list goes on and on and on. And so there were definite things that when you looked at it, you thought, how could these people be the poorest when they should be the most wealthy? Because for the Treaty of Ruby Valley that was signed in 1863, minerals and rights to the land were never given up. What was given up was passage, and it was a treaty of friendship. And so there was all these resources being extracted, and none of it was going to any of the tribes. So all this resource on a daily basis being extracted, and the tribes from Nevada being the poorest individuals of any economic, social background in the state of Nevada, just didn't sit well with me. So it had to have a financial piece. And, exploring what was going on up in Canada, because part of my job down in the States was dealing with indigenous groups. And so I would go and meet with the First Nations tribes and the industry and how they were treating First Nations.
Okay.
And I couldn't understand why it couldn't happen down here.
Chairman Brian Mason of the Shoshone Paiute Tribes of the Duck Valley Reservation, kicking off our conversation here today on Native America Calling, learning about a new partnership with a mining company. It's touted as the first of its kind in the continental United States. Join the conversation. Let us know your thoughts on mining. 1-800-996-2848. Virginia driving hawk Sneevy started writing more than 50 years ago, in part to counter the stereotypical narrative that her own children were exposed to in school. She has now released her own memoir, Special Places, Sacred Circles, recounting the many people who influenced her life. We'll hear from Sneevy on the next Native America Calling.
Who protects Indian country? Amerind does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Amerind helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Amerind is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We're looking at potential new legal and economic frameworks for mining companies working with tribes. We also want to hear from you today, our listeners. What is your tribe's relationship with mining? Let us know. You can join us with your comments or questions. Just call 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. And you can always comment on our website or social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. We're joined right now by Chairman Brian Mason of the Shoshone Paiute Tribes of the Duck Valley Reservation. He's speaking with us in Oahe, Nevada. And Chairman, your community has a history with mining, a fraught history with mining. There's an abandoned copper mine near the reservation, and it has been linked with water pollution issues, water quality issues. I'm curious to know now, how do you convince tribal members to continue to invest in mining based on some of this history?
Well, so, there's not just the Shoshone Paiute Tribes, it's almost every tribe in Nevada that you can name has a historic legacy mine next door. I don't know what the dynamic is, but when I was in the environmental group with Barrick, we had to do studies and work on closed mines. And it's a legacy that Nevada has, and it seems to be next to every reservation. So, obviously pre World War II up until, mining regulations in the 80s, there wasn't any groundwater protection that's afforded now. But, that is a legacy mine that we've dealt with. It mined all the way, one of the only mines that didn't close during World War II. It's since been closed now, but it's been redone about 2 or 3 times. And, it's actually a super fun site, and our tribal members have worked on that piece of property for probably 3 or 4 different times when they go in each time in an attempt to encapsulate some of the discharge that still comes from the tailings of that particular piece of property.
Okay.
But, like I said, in Nevada, these are things that tribes here in the state have dealt with since, since they started mining in the 1800s.
Okay. Now, I know we can't get into details with regard to the actual financials of this partnership, but it's no secret that gold is trading at record highs right now. It's nearly $5,000 an ounce. And this partnership, it includes provisions to support language revitalization and other efforts towards economic development. What are you excited about in terms of the potential that this partnership could make really a big impact in your community?
Well, the first one is that language revitalization. We're right in the middle of it right now, actually working with Integra and the Boise State on revitalizing a course at the university where kids can go in the summer, study the language so it doesn't die. Because once a culture loses the language, they lose the culture. And so revitalization of the language is the most important thing. And that is going to be, almost totally funded by the agreement with Integra. They realize how important this is to us as a people. And so that to them is one of their priorities as well. And they've already, committed, the financial backing to make sure that that does not happen to us. I've gone to many endangered indigenous language conferences, and one of the most traumatic things I saw was a lady from one of the tribes of Washington State, one of the last speakers of her language, if not the last. And she just gave this tearful presentation on how the language is gone. And we are not going to let that happen for the Shoshone or the Paiute language for the people here in Duck Valley.
Understood, Chairman Mason. I think so many of our listeners right now can completely relate to what you describe. Thanks for coming on the show today and educating us.
Okay.
Let's move on now to Kate Finn, the founder and director of the Tall Grass Institute. She joins us now from Los Angeles, California. And Kate, you and our other guest, Miranda Compton, have done research on this partnership model that we're talking about between the Shoshone Paiute Tribes and Integra Resources. Can you explain the importance of a tribal benefit agreement and why you support this approach?
Absolutely. So I had the pleasure to work with Miranda on our report on tribal benefit agreements. And really, there's kind of two main components that drove that report. And the first is to show the history and context that agreements are being made in. And as the chairman so aptly stated, there is a history in Indian country of mining. And there's a history of agreements. And unfortunately, a lot of that history is that tribes and Native peoples have not been able to exercise their sovereignty and their self-determination in those agreements. And so anytime there's any negotiation with a private company or a mining company, that company has to understand the context and the inertia that they are working with in Indian country. And so the report really sets out what that is. And then, the second part that we really set out to do was to set up the context of tribal benefit agreements and community benefit agreements within the context of the UN Declaration. In the Declaration, both Article 20 and 23 talk about Indigenous peoples' right to pursue their own economic priorities and to have those priorities respected. And community benefit agreements, tribal benefit agreements can be a tool to do just that, to make sure that there is equity in participation, equity in decision making, and that those economic priorities that are unique to that land, unique to that tribe, really come forward in the context of mining, which of course, mining is a long-term endeavor. There is a lot going on from the actual project to reclamation and for a long time. So really focusing on sovereignty and self-determination is a way to bring community benefit agreements to a place of alignment, I think, with both the private sector and Indigenous peoples.
Kate, this agreement we're talking about today, it's on trust land. Do you see unique opportunities to replicate agreements like this with other tribes on trust land, or does it only complicate the issue of having it on trust land? I'm interested to know.
I think this is a really important agreement because it shows that it's possible. And it shows that agreements can reflect the priorities of the tribe and that they really can pick up on the jurisdictional aspects of the land there. But I also want to note that this is a rare example. And so it's really important for companies to go in and know that there are jurisdictional issues there, and that this might not be the same thing for every tribe in the United States.
Now, the current presidential administration, it's no secret also that they're taking a deregulatory approach to natural resource extraction. And I'm also interested to know this lack of federal protection. How do you see it benefiting or hurting partnership agreements moving forward?
As we write in our report, the way that tribal benefit agreements can be the best, the way that they can be a tool for sovereignty, is when they come in the context of a very ripe engagement. When the company spends time with the tribe, when the tribe is able to participate fully, when there's free and full sharing of information in a very direct manner, and when that engagement spans time, and when that's true, when the tribe really does consent to the project, and when that engagement is ripe, then a tribal benefit agreement can be really, really positive. So, the environment, in a deregulatory environment, often the first thing that kind of gets diminished is the consultation, right? Consultation regime of the government with tribes. And absent good consultation, absent, good communication, it's really hard to see where community benefit agreements and tribal benefit agreements can be used in a really good way.
Kate, I'm thinking a lot of folks that might be listening to the show right now could be thinking to themselves, this sounds great on paper, but they might be worried, geez, it seems like it would be easy perhaps for a tribe to be taken advantage of in a deal like this, especially with a powerful mining company. What kind of safeguards are in place to make sure that all parties honor this partnership moving forward?
I think that's it, right? That's the history, that's the inertia. And in many communities in the United States, you walk in and talk about community benefit agreements and they stink, right? There's a particular stink to those kinds of agreements. And so, once again, what I can say is every tribe is unique. Every tribe has their unique priorities. And it's really important that the engagement that comes and leads to an agreement really is based on consent and has consent at its core, so that there is equity in decision making and equity in participation. And I think it's important too, like we are talking today about agreements with the mining industry, which is very large and has a real history. But there's a lot of ways that community benefit agreements can be made as to other types of development that can begin to really build a good engagement, good context for the tribe.
Thanks, Kate. 1-800-99-NATIVE. That is the number for any listeners who would like to join this conversation. Weigh in your thoughts with regard to mining on tribal lands. Maybe you are a member of a Native community that has mining interests either at present or in the past. We'd like to hear from you. How's it working out? 1-800-99-NATIVE. Miranda Compton joins us now from Missoula, Montana. She is founder and president of the consulting company Lepway. And Miranda, we mentioned earlier that your work aligns with Kate's. Can you describe more of what you do and what led you down in this direction?
Yeah, thanks. I started out as a lawyer. I practiced federal Indian law for about 15 years. And by the time things got to my desk as a lawyer, it was often in a bad state. We were often in a litigious, there were lawsuits, people weren't really talking to each other. And that's a hard fight. It's a hard fight for tribes. It costs a lot of money. And I wanted to try to work in spaces that didn't necessarily require the courts. Now, some decisions still obviously go to the courts, which are not always friendly to tribal nations and don't often know that history that Kate was talking about. But I wanted to work more in a business strategy capacity with tribes and non-tribal entities. So that's what I do at Lepway. I work with tribes and non-tribal entities on developments, typically in the energy and tech spaces. And through that work, really try to find ways that we can center sovereignty early in the development process to create better projects so that tribal nations are not just impacted entities. I think for so long, and definitely in the mining space, tribes are just impacted by mines. We are at the tail end of a federal permitting process, and we get left with a lot of the negative impacts, a lot of the water and land quality impacts, and we're not involved in the development of the plan of operations for the mine. How are they actually going to mine? Where are the mine facilities going to be? How can we develop if we are, allowing or accepting mining operations near our lands? How are we engaging in that actual operation to decrease those impacts? So I think Kate and I at Tallgrass and Lepway really wanted to dig into community benefit agreements because that is a relatively recent tool that is being used to provide an on-ramp, an opportunity for tribes to engage in that development process outside of typically the federal consultation process. And you heard the chairman talk about consultation versus consent. And in consultation, the federal government is coming to tribes and saying, hey, here's this project. It's been in development for 5 years or 10 years and millions of dollars have already been spent. Are you going to say no to it? And if you are going to say no, what are the 2 small things we can change to make you say yes? That's a really bad position for tribes to be in. When tribes engage directly with project proponents like mining companies, they can often have a much more effective role in how that mine develops. And I think the Integra and agreement really shows that.
Thank you, Miranda. And I also want to provide some clarification here. I mentioned earlier that the proposed mine or the project is located on trust land. It's important to note that the mine actually includes a mix of both federal and public lands. So just want to make sure we're getting the right information out there to our listeners. And again, 1-800-99-NATIVE, that is the number if you would like to join today's conversation. Miranda, we've got a break coming up here in a couple of minutes, but I do want to ask you one more question before we move on. And it's in regards to some research that was performed by a finance company, MSCI. The majority of minerals in the United States, for example, nickel, copper, lithium, all located within 35 miles of Native American reservations. So the question really begs itself, how can tribes protect themselves from mining developers seeking these minerals early on, and also just really understand the leverage that they might hold and just, again, challenges and opportunities that are presented here?
Yeah, and I think that actually speaks also to the clarification you just made. So often companies, particularly in the U.S., I think that it's different in Canada and some other places, but so often companies here think we are off tribal land, we do not have tribal issues. What we in Indian country know, and as the chairman pointed out, reservation boundaries are but one of the guidelines for tribal jurisdiction and interests. Our interest and rights also include treaty boundaries. So if you think about those resources being within 35 miles of modern day reservations, I can guarantee you, and we don't have the stats on it, but I can guarantee you that a vast majority of those are within actual treaty areas where tribes continue to have rights regarding lands and waters and animals and plants. And so for tribal nations and for companies, mining companies, but really any companies, we need to take a better look at these maps and make sure that we are identifying the whole universe, the whole scope of tribal rights, which includes tribal lands where tribes always have consent about whether or not a project will go forward, but also what are the rights associated with those treaty areas? What are the rights associated with our ancestral areas, which are even larger? And for tribal nations, when there are projects within those areas, actively engaging with the company, yes, we can still maintain our federal consultation, government to government consultation. We're not waiving that or giving that up, but still working with the companies is a great way to make sure you have impacts on that development.
All right, we're going to take this short break here. We'll come back, continue our conversation, and we're going to pivot into another topic as well. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Tribal Development Partners, helping tribes build toward their goals through 105L leasing and essential facility development, empowering sovereignty, strengthening community. More at tribaldevpartners.com, proud supporters of this show.
Need an actionable plan to achieve your goals? Kaufman & Associates strengthens Native organizations through culturally grounded strategic planning. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We'll continue our discussion at potential new legal and economic frameworks for mining companies working with tribes. Join the conversation. We're at 1-800-996-2848. One of our guests today, Kate Finn, is the founder and director of the Tall Grass Institute. And Kate, in addition to this tribe we're talking about today, the Shoshone Paiute in Nevada and also parts of Idaho, you've worked as an advisor with these types of agreements with other indigenous communities in other parts of the world. And I'm interested to know, how are you seeing these agreements being implemented outside the U.S. and what are some examples of success?
Yeah, so I do have the privilege of working with Indigenous peoples all over the world. And, the experience of Indigenous peoples with companies varies, but I can say that there really is progress when we're talking about benefit sharing and shared prosperity, and particularly with kind of smaller, more local projects. There's a lot to be said about allowing Indigenous peoples to put forward their priorities early in the process. And those priorities can be making sure that every household has running water, making sure that folks in the community are trained on whatever technology is being brought. There's really this opportunity, I think, right now to look at, yes, the financial health and well-being and making sure that the financial benefits are shared, but also, that certain areas are avoided if they have impacts on sacred lands. And that there is true economic development for Indigenous people. So, around the world, I see a lot of companies are very interested in implementing CBAs with Indigenous peoples. And really, it all comes back to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and making sure that all engagement with Indigenous peoples is from a place of respect and from a place of really looking at consent. Have the Indigenous peoples consented to the project? Or have they not, right? And often, we'll tell companies, you have to spend a lot of time with Indigenous peoples. You have to know whether this project is going to be a positive development for the community or not. And that happens early on. And so when engagement is taking place with consent in mind and sovereignty as the North Star, then there can be real benefits for both Indigenous peoples and the companies.
Thank you, Kate. We're going to now get perspectives on a new proposed rule by the Environmental Protection Agency that could diminish the power of tribes to protect water. The section currently allows tribes to weigh in on energy projects like oil pipelines and the location of data centers. And to do this, I'd like to introduce two more guests on the show now. First, Melissa Kay, who joins us from Boulder, Colorado. She is a Tribal Water Institute Fellow at the Native American Rights Fund. Melissa, good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And joining us from Grand Forks, North Dakota is James Grijalva. He is a professor of law at the University of North Dakota School of Law. James, hello to you as well, and great to have you on the show.
Hello, Sean. Great pronunciation. Maybe the first person to ever get it correctly.
I'm working on it, James. I'm learning a lot about how to pronounce names on the show. Thank you so much. Well, Melissa, let's start with you. What is this proposed EPA rule around oil pipelines and data center permitting? What does it mean for tribes?
Yeah, so the proposed rule is a revision of Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And in a lot of ways, the proposed changes to the current rule restrict what states and authorized tribes that implement that Section 401 permitting certification. So it's essentially like anytime a project needs to get a certification because it'll be discharging into waters of the United States, so, triggering the Clean Water Act, that it needs to get permitting, and that permitting certification comes from states or comes from authorized tribes that have a particular type of authority under the EPA. And so what exactly that certification consists of and what it's allowed to consider and what kind of conditions it's allowed to place on a project, both in terms of the types of conditions if a project gets the permit and is able to operate, and also going all the way to a potential veto of the permit altogether, meaning that the project can't be sited where it was previously proposed or can't do the discharges that would trigger that Clean Water Act jurisdiction. That all of that gets a lot further restricted under the proposed rule and the changes to the proposed rule.
So what are tribes most worried about now? That the potential here that waters could be contaminated and they won't have any way to prevent that? They won't have any way to do inspections or possibly prevent projects that could pose grave risks for communities in the future?
Yes, I would say that definitely is one of the main concerns. The way that the Section 401 certification process is set up right now, there's sort of a particular set of paths that tribes that, operate their own Section 401 programs that they take in terms of being notified by the EPA that a certain type of pollution and discharge will be happening, have a period of time to consider, what that means in terms of violations of the tribe's own water quality standards or regulations that the tribe has put in place to protect water quality related issues. So, that can be falling underneath, other types of Clean Water Act regulatory programs, or it can just be the tribe's own regulations that it has put in place to protect ceremonial uses, to protect fishing and hunting, to protect other things related to water quality. And the ability for tribes to rely on those other laws and other regulations, and also to be allowed to consider like a project as a whole, as opposed to just that very specific, the discharge that is impacting the already restricted waters of the United States. We've seen other rollbacks happening in terms of how the EPA is considering what constitutes waters of the United States that have that jurisdiction. So everything's just getting a lot tighter, and it's just really going to limit the ability for tribes and for states to be able to basically consider and put into place all of the conditions that they might otherwise be able to under the current regulation.
Thanks, Melissa. James, in a 2023 article, you said Clean Water Act standards, they don't exist in Indian country. Can you explain more about that? And again, what's most at stake with regard to tribes here?
Well, I'm certainly glad somebody read that article, Sean. The reality is that what Melissa was talking about is kind of a split that Congress made when it enacted the modern Clean Water Act in 1972. It provided a role for the federal government, but also a role for states, and then later tribes were added to that. And the idea that's relevant here is that the Clean Water Act is very specific in that Section 401 Melissa was talking about. A federal agency cannot issue a permit and cannot issue a license if the state where the discharge into the waters is going to occur, or if the tribe the discharge is going to be into their waters, then the state or the tribe has to certify that the discharge is going to be consistent with the tribal or the state water quality standards and requirements. And the idea was to make sure that a federal agency didn't sort of ride roughshod over a state or a tribe that had standards that were different than, say, an adjacent state or tribe. We're trying to make sure that there's a minimum level of environmental water quality protection across the country, but states and tribes both have the ability to make more stringent requirements. More specifically, if I could take another second, Sean, before your next question, most tribes haven't used the Clean Water Act approach to get water quality standards developed and then approved by EPA. And if you have water quality standards approved by EPA, either as a state or a tribe, then that increases the leverage that you have on projects that happen in your territory and adjacent to your territory, just upstream, that might affect your water quality and particularly the uses that you make of your waters. And unlike most, state residents, tribes make not only uses of water to drink and to feed and to water cattle and to water plants and to use for manufacturing, but they also use it in very important cultural ways. And those cultural ways are not protected by the state standards because that's a different set of standards and interests. So the role that tribes play is really important. But most tribes haven't been approved. That article you mentioned, I think it was 15% then. I think it's 17% of the eligible tribes now have standards approved by EPA. But some tribes have developed a set of water quality requirements that don't have to or haven't gone through any kind of federal approval process. And part of the new rule, the intention is to exclude those things, those standards that tribes or states have developed that haven't been approved by EPA. And the idea is to narrow the scope, as Melissa said, partly to get the process of permitting done faster, and also, I think, partly to narrow the substantive conditions that can be imposed on these activities.
Thanks, James. That's a lot of really helpful background there. Melissa, what actions are people who are opposed to this change? What are they taking? What's going on?
So right now there's a comment period. So the proposed rule was released, about a week and a half ago, and the comment period goes until February 17th. And that's basically just an opportunity for tribes, for states, for other interested parties, the public, to be able to comment on the language of the rule. And then, it will go back under consideration by the EPA, and they will go ahead and publish a final rule that either takes into account some of those comments and changes. They have to take them into account, but whether anything changes is to be seen. So, that's the stage that we're at right now. And NARF is involved in, submitting comments, and as are many other organizations and tribes. But, we'll kind of have to see what comes out in the final rule. And then there was a very similar process that happened after the rule was changed under the first Trump administration in 2020. A lot of the same language changes, just restricting in a lot of the same ways. And there was litigation that came after that. so I would anticipate, that there would be litigation following a final rule here as well if all of the changes go into place.
And Melissa, what is EPA saying right now? What is their justification for this proposal?
Well, the sort of language that they're using in terms of justification is tied to a lot of other changes in kind of the administrative state that we've seen over the past couple of years. And so a big one is that, there is actually a Supreme Court case that considered the scope of that section 401, and said, okay, we think that the way that it's interpreted by EPA at the time, which was the broader interpretation that sort of considered the activity as a whole and was permitted, placing the conditions on considering not just that single discharge, but kind of the entire activity and how it impacts water quality in a much broader sense, that the Supreme Court affirmed that interpretation. However, we've seen other Supreme Court decisions in the past couple of years that have sort of changed the relationship between agencies and courts. And getting rid of some of the sort of expectations that courts would give a lot of deference to agencies and agency interpretation. And so what's happening now is that they're using that to kind of say, oh, we have a new reading of what this rule means.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. We've got a couple of minutes here before we have to wrap up. James, I want to go back to you because we heard Melissa mention how in 2020, during the first Trump administration, these rules were weakened for tribes and states. And then it's important to note that they were reinstated during the Biden administration. So now we're going back. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth here, a lot of seesawing. Where does this leave tribes, really, in terms of just these vast differences in federal policies? And this is just one example we're talking about today with regard to the EPA. But what do you see in terms of how tribes need to navigate these changing landscapes?
I think tribes are one of a group of people trying to figure out what exactly is going to happen. The reality is that administrative state that Melissa mentioned, it has a lot of power. EPA has a lot of power. Now, Congress can limit the agency's power by being very clear and directive in the statute as to what can and can't be considered. But there's always ambiguity, or there's always a place where, data centers didn't exist 20 years ago, and maybe there's something specific about them that makes it an interesting or different kind of concern to approach, but the language is ambiguous now that we see it from this new perspective. And usually, and for many years as I taught administrative law, I would tell my students that generally speaking, the court is deferential to expert agencies because Congress chose them for this reason. They know what the technical issues are. They know about hazardous materials, et cetera, and the courts don't. And so the courts shouldn't be second guessing. What the Supreme Court did recently was to say essentially questions of law, like interpreting the words Congress uses in a statute, that's the bailiwick or the expertise of the court. An agency doesn't have any particular expertise in interpreting the Supreme Court decisions. It has expertise on, technical carcinogens or water quality or water pollution. And so the court has basically said, when it comes down to deciding what a statute means, it's the court's job to do that. And certainly agencies have to interpret the statutes that give them authority, but they don't always, they know that there is always a possibility that someone will sue and second guess them.
All right. Thank you so much, James. We are out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up. But big thanks to our guests who joined us, James Grijalva, Melissa Kay, Chairman Brian Mason, Miranda Compton, and Kate Finn. Join us again tomorrow when we'll hear from Sichanju Lakota elder and acclaimed author Virginia Driving Hawk Sneevy about her new memoir. I'm Sean Spruce. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Support by the American Indian College Fund. The American Indian College Fund provides millions of dollars of scholarships to thousands of Native students every year. Tribal citizens of every age and experience are eligible. The deadline for applications is May 31st, and you can find everything you need to apply at collegefund.org. That's collegefund.org or by phone at 800-766-FUND. Education is the answer.
Repatriation is the return of ancestors and stolen culture. The Association on American Indian Affairs is hosting the 11th annual Repatriation Conference, Feeding the Fire, Advancing the Movement, in February 2026. This fully virtual conference will offer small group interactive workshops, strategies, networking, and more to advance domestic and international repatriation. More at indian-affairs.org. The association supports this show.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.